This week on The Watchman, we are back on Israel's Golan Heights, less than a mile from the Syrian border. Why are we here? Because this is the place where Iran and Israel are on a collision course. The Iranian regime has directly attacked Israel from right across the border here in Syria, firing missiles at Israeli territory. Israel has responded with overwhelming force and sent a message to the Iranians that an Iranian presence in Syria is an absolute red line. And unlike some, the Israelis keep their red lines. Today, you will hear the inside story of what Iran is doing just a mile from where I'm standing right now in Syria, and how the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, are fighting back. It's The Watchman. It's Christians United for Israel, only right here on TBN from the Golan Heights. And welcome to The Watchman. What a time to be in Israel. The U.S. Embassy has moved right here to Jerusalem, where it belongs. President Trump has pulled America out of the disastrous Iran nuclear deal. And on May 10th, Israel and Iran had their first direct military confrontation just a few short hours north of here in Syria. And folks, it was a big one. Iranian forces fired at least 20 missiles at Israel from Syrian territory. Now, Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system shot down 4 of those Iranian missiles, and the rest fell short of reaching Israel, thankfully. Israel responded to this act of war from Iran with devastating and decisive force. In a daring operation, Israeli fighter jets destroyed much of the military infrastructure that Iran has been building up inside Syria. It was the largest Israeli operation in Syria since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and Iran paid a severe price for its continued attempts to establish a foothold in Syria from which it can attack Israel. Folks, it's all part of the Iranian regime's grand strategy to destroy the Jewish state. They want to surround Israel on all sides, whether through Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and now Syria. Well, our team at Christians United for Israel just so happened to have a delegation right here in May, and less than 24 hours after Israel and Iran battled in Syria, our founder and chairman, Pastor John Hagee, traveled with me and others from our CUFI team to Israel's border with Syria and looked out at the site where there had been fierce fighting only hours before. Pastor Hagee and I met up on the Golan Heights with the international spokesman of the Israel Defense Forces, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, to get the inside story of what went down between Israel and Iran just one night before. Take a look. This has been going on for a few weeks now, kind of leading up to this moment where Iran struck directly in a hostile act against Israeli territory. Tell us about what went down here less than 24 hours ago.
This time, the Iranians attacked us directly by firing 20 rockets from inside Syria towards Israeli positions on the Golan Heights. Luckily, no casualties in Israel. 4 of the rockets were intercepted by the Iron Dome system, and the rest fell short. So at the end of that event, before we retaliated, the Iranians had in fact failed with their attempt to strike at Israel, which is a great thing. We then felt that it was appropriate and that the message needed to be delivered to the Iranians that this was totally intolerable from an Israeli perspective.
An act of war, I mean.
An act of war, an aggression by Iran against Israel, and we felt that a strong message needed to be delivered. We decided to strike 70 military targets that belong to Iran and that are part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force deployment inside Iran. We struck those targets, we struck them well. Our pilots reported accurate hits. Our BDA tells us that they were destroyed. And I'm happy to say that our planes were able to deliver their payload, return back home safely, and without any casualties to Israel.
This is keeping with the Iranian ideology. They're on the march across the region. They control 4 Arab capitals. They're opening a land corridor from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean. So this was, as you said, Iran testing the waters, and then finally last night, and thankfully it was a failure, this Iranian attack.
Yeah, it's important to say, Israel is not a warmongering state. We are here to defend ourselves. We are inside Israel, holding our own, minding our own business, and asking the question, what are Iranian forces looking for 1,000 miles from home? It cannot be that they're bringing about peace, and they're sure as not bringing about economic development or anything.
Why are they building a military infrastructure right next door to Israel?
Exactly, and they're clear about it. At least they're not lying about it. They're saying that they do that in order to be able to terrorize Israeli civilians and to be able to have the capability to strike Israel. We have been clear about the fact that we are not going to allow it. Yesterday night was a good example of the resolve and the military capabilities of the IDF that delivered a clear message, a precise, professional message that struck targets and targets only. What needed to be struck was struck, nothing else, and where substantial damage was made to the Iranian capabilities. Let's hope that the Iranians heed the warning and understand that it is not in their interest and not in Syria's interest and not in the region's interest for them to be attacking Israel.
Yeah, major setback for the Iranian adventure in Syria last night, Jonathan. Pastor, at CUFI, we've been talking about this for years. Iran's goals, its ideology to wipe the Jewish state off the map. What are your immediate thoughts on what went down here just a day ago?
What went down here was just another provocation by the state of Iran to demonstrate that what they've been chanting in the streets, death to the Jews, is exactly what they are looking for. The American people need to focus in this time when we're talking about the significance of the Iran deal, that our president has made a bold and decisive decision that very dramatically helped the state of Israel, and it's going to save lots of Jewish lives. They also need to focus on the fact that when you mention Iran, their 2 proxy armies are here named Hezbollah and Hamas. They trained, they equipped, and they have organized these 2 terrorist organizations. But when you think about the military conflicts that are happening, always track it back to Iran, because they're the head of the snake in the Middle East.
Exactly, and that pulling out of that Iran deal, Pastor, you make a great point, saved Israeli lives. I believe it saved American lives as well in the long term. Jonathan, okay, looking into the crystal ball going forward here, I guess you would say, what comes next? Now, Iran, a decisive response by the IDF, but Iran still has its proxy Hezbollah not far from here in Lebanon with some 130,000 rockets and missiles aimed at the Jewish state. The Quds Force trying to maintain that presence in Syria. What's the IDF looking at next? Threats on all sides, it seems like.
There's an abundance of threats, but we know that we are strong. We have the full support of our greatest ally, the US, and we know that we trust in our capabilities to continue to defend the Jewish state and to do it well, despite all the threats. I'd like to say that I'd hope that the message will be strong enough for Iran to understand, and not only for Iran, but for Hezbollah to see that what happened in 2006 would only be a prelude, only be an introduction to the what would happen should Hezbollah make the wrongful decision to attack Israel. Very important to understand that we have now the good people of Israel who live in the northern part of Israel have been enjoying 11 years of quiet and stability. You just saw how peaceful and blooming the northern part of Israel is. That's exactly how we want to keep it. We will be able to keep it that way by constantly making sure that our enemies, like Hezbollah, know how strong we are, know how much we know about them, their capabilities, their whereabouts, and their locations and their intentions, and make sure that they understand that it is not in their interest to be attacking Israel.
Pastor, along those lines, any final thoughts from here on the Golan Heights?
I think it's important for the American people to recognize that if there was ever a time for us to stand boldly with Israel and the Jewish people, it's right now. Israel is just trying to pursue peace We are standing with Israel as a nation, and it's time for the citizens of our country, especially every member of Christians United for Israel, to stand up verbally and actually for the state of Israel.
Yeah, Pastor, thank you so much. Lieutenant Colonel
you, sir.
Jonathan Conricus, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We'll have much more after the break from here on the Israeli Golan Heights, just a few short miles from Syria, a country that is on fire. Well, up next, we stay on the Syrian border with a former high-ranking Israeli intelligence officer who takes us deeper on Iran's dangerous plans and why the U.S. pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal is a game changer. It's the Watchman. It's Christians United for Israel, only right here on TBN.
Coming soon to Christians United for Israel's Washington, D.C. Summit, one of America's most beloved pro-Israel champions. This year's keynote speaker is United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley.
The United States refuses to accept the double standard that says we are not impartial. When we stand by the will of the American people by moving our U.S. Embassy. But somehow the United Nations is a neutral party when it consistently singles out Israel for condemnation.
You don't want to miss hearing this voice of truth that has turned the United Nations upside down.
We don't have a greater friend than Israel. The days of Israel bashing are over.
Join Ambassador Nikki Haley at the Christians United for Israel Summit in Washington, D.C. on July 23rd and 24th. I'll see you there.
This is an area you're very familiar with, working high up in intelligence for the IDF, working here up north. What's your immediate reaction and impression to what happened just last night with Iran trying to barrage Israel with missiles?
I think what we saw yesterday is an example how the Iranian regime doesn't understand science and messages. I think Israel, from the Prime Minister Netanyahu all the way down to the Chief of Staff and the Army, is saying to the Iran regime, don't test us. We will not allow you to go into Syria. We will not do the same mistakes as we did with Lebanon and Hezbollah.
Iran is here, in their view, they're here to stay in Syria, right? Just a mile from where we're standing right now. We're in Israel right now, but less than a mile from where we're standing right now, Iran is determined to have a permanent presence here at Israel's doorstep in Syria.
Yes, Iran took a strategic decision a couple years ago to open a front here with us. What we saw yesterday is the struggle between us and them, but us not allowing them to do it. Yeah. It will take time. It's the Middle East, you know, people think slowly and sometimes react slowly, but we have patience. And we will not allow it. It's very simple, you know. Yeah. I think it was clear not only to Iran yesterday, also to Hezbollah, that is looking upon this event and said, okay, the game is changed now.
Yeah, that's an interesting factor here, Marco. You know, again, working in Israeli intelligence during your time in the IDF, you worked frequently, specialized up here in the north. You're very familiar with Hezbollah. How do they factor into all of this, maybe even into an Iranian response?
If I'm Hezbollah now, sitting now in Dahya, it's in the west part of Beirut, I'm also need to recalculate my route. Yeah. Because I think what Israel showed here to Hezbollah and Iran, that we have seems to be a very good intel about what's going on. Yeah. So if we react for 20 missiles as we react yesterday, imagine what will happen if something worse will happen.
This has been a very eventful week between the strikes here in Syria and President Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. What are your thoughts on that? As an Israeli, a great thing, I believe, as an American, a great thing for the United States. Talk about your thoughts on it.
I think President Trump sent two messages recently to the Middle East and to the world. To the Middle East, President Trump said, if there is dinner and you're not invited, you will find yourself on the menu. The second message President Trump sent to the world, especially to North Korea, is once President Trump is taking the sword out, he will not take it back to the belt very quickly.
In the Middle East, they respect strength,
Yes,
and he's showing strength.
he's showing strength and he sees things clearly.
Yeah.
He's not confused. Good for us that we have President Trump that is taking care of us and watching our back here.
And good to see the leader of the free world showing some moral clarity. And again, a big week, Marco. We have what's going on. We hear some gunfire, I think, in the distance right now in Syria, right behind us, by the way. What a week. What an amazing time to be here in the Golan Heights. And by the way, folks, there's things Marco knows that he can't tell us. So we appreciate what you did share, my friend. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for joining us here in the Golan. Thanks, Marco. Well, coming up after the break, the one and only Pastor John Hagee joins us from that Syrian border to share what all of these battles mean for Israel, America, and you. Folks, you won't want to miss these prophetic insights from Pastor Hagee. Don't move.
The Bible calls Jerusalem the city of God, where God has placed his name. Our fight in the defense of Israel and the Jewish people has only just begun. Your presence in this auditorium is a testimonial to the nation and the nations of the world that Israel is surrounded by friends in America that will stand with them against all odds. Your going to Congress is a righteous act in the courts of heaven.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are part of a movement right now. If you are here tonight, it is not by coincidence. Christians United for Israel is by God and for God.
King David said it this way, "Let God arise and let his enemies be scattered."
And welcome back to the Watchman. We are still here on Israel's Golan Heights. Right behind me, less than a mile away, is one of the hottest hot zones in the world, Syria. And we're with our founder and chairman of Christians United for Israel, the one and only Pastor John Hagee. And Pastor, wow, you know, we've been talking about this for years. You've been leading the charge, warning about the Iranian regime. Yes. And now we see it all hitting the fan, absolutely, I guess you would say. What are your thoughts on this latest provocation by the Iranian regime?
The American people need to know that the head of the snake in the Middle East is Iran. Iran sponsors, trains, and equips Hamas and Hezbollah. Those are two very large terrorist organizations that are on the border of the state of Israel. And so when Americans hear Hamas and Hezbollah, the issue in the Middle East is Iran, and our president has done a great thing in helping Israel by nixing that nuclear deal. It's very, very advantageous for Israel because Iran fully intends to destroy Israel. When you have thousands of citizens in the streets chanting month after month, year after year, death to the Jews, that's what they intend to do.
And death to America.
Absolutely. When someone in history threatens to kill you, you need to pay attention. Yeah. Whenever Hitler said that he was going to destroy the Jews, people said, well, he's just having a bad day. But that didn't prove to be true. Iran is threatening to destroy Israel and the Jewish people, and they mean to do it. And when they get a nuclear capability to destroy the Jewish people, they will use it even if they know other nations are going to retaliate with nuclear force. Some of the leaders have said, so half of us are murdered or killed, we all go to heaven. That's their idea.
And I think of those Iranian ballistic missiles as well that they're working on that can travel long distances, Pastor. Last question. We're here, again, less than 24 hours after a major Iranian attack on Israeli territory. We're here as Christians United for Israel. We have a delegation right here on the Golan Heights. We're meeting with the Israel Defense Forces. Talk about the impact we're having, Pastor, at CUFI, and if you can also mention why it's so important for folks back home to attend our Washington Summit on July 23rd and 24th in D.C.
Let's talk about the impact of CUFI. Never in the history of Christianity has there been created what God has created through CUFI in the past year since 2006. And here's how that works. One, it was one thing for Christians to unify as a religious block of people to support the Jewish people because we have a Bible mandate to do that. Any Christian who can read the Bible fully understands, beginning at Genesis 1:1, that God clearly intended to bless the Jewish people and intended for the nations of the world to bless the Jewish people. So here we are as a Christian nation, and we now have 4.1 million people who will respond by sending an email to Washington or make a phone call to Washington to a senator or to a congressman that's taking a stand against Israel. We also have a 501c4. Citizens call them lobbyists, and they go see people who are in discord with the state of Israel.
And we're pushing for pro-Israel legislation in Congress.
We are a one-issue organization, Israel, Israel, and Israel. And our objective is that the grassroots empowers our voices in Washington, and our voices in Washington empower the grassroots.
It's a movement.
We now have access to the ambassadors of both Israel and America on a first-name basis. We now have access to the highest levels of government on a first-name basis. There are wonderful, wonderful things happening that have never, ever happened in the history of Christianity before. And that's why coming to our national summit in Washington, D.C., the 22nd and 23rd and 24th of July, is that when we pack that auditorium with 5,000 or 6,000 people, it sends a message to America and to the world the strength of our organization. And I encourage every person watching this television program right now that you immediately make plans to be in Washington on those dates, because we're going to go see your congressman and your senator standing up for Israel, and that's what the Bible says to do. For Zion's sake, I will not be silent, because to see evil and not call it evil is evil. Not to speak is to speak, and God will not hold us blameless. Therefore, we need to show up in force in Washington, D.C. this July.
Pastor, thank you so much from the Golan Heights. Wow, exciting to be here. We live in exciting times. Thanks, Pastor.
Yes, we do.
As always, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. God bless you for what you do. You're doing a fabulous job here. And God bless you and all of the listeners and all of our partners at CUFI.
Up next, my final thoughts on Iran's war against Israel and why it is doomed to failure. It's The Watchman. It's CUFI, only right here on TBN from Jerusalem. Stick around.
Wars, terrorism, boycotts, international condemnation, anti-Semitic lies. None of these things have been able to destroy the hope, generosity, courage, and ingenuity of the Jewish state. Israeli scientists and inventors are on the cutting edge of exciting breakthroughs in medicine, technology, and agriculture. For 70 years, Israel has faced overwhelming odds and miraculously triumphed. The Jewish people have not only survived, they have thrived. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And the world needs to know the truth. This palm-sized snapshot of Israel at 70, Just the Facts, will help you share Israel's history and accomplishments with everyone you meet. Call Christians United for Israel at 210-477-4714 or go to CUFI.org/facts to receive your free gift. Israel is not a problem for the world to solve. Israel is solving the world's problems. Facts matter, so help CUFI share the truth about Israel at 70.
And welcome back. Folks, if the month of May was any indication, then fasten your seatbelts for a momentous remainder of 2018 and good things for Israel and America. Look, for decades, the Iranian regime has wreaked havoc across the region and the world, murdering innocent people, sponsoring terrorism, and vowing to wipe the United States and Israel off the map. Over the past few years, Iran has only grown stronger, dominating Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon, and creating a land corridor stretching from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean Sea at Israel's doorstep. Rarely has Iran paid a price for any of these actions, until now. Not only has Israel struck and struck hard against Iran's military machine in Syria, President Trump has pulled the United States out of that disastrous Iran nuclear deal, which had rewarded Iran with billions of dollars in sanctions relief. And what about the bold operation by the Israeli Mossad to nab thousands of top-secret documents from inside Tehran, which Prime Minister Netanyahu then presented to the world, proving Iran's illicit nuclear weapons program? For the first time in a long time, Iran's momentum across this region has suffered major setbacks, thanks to strong leadership in Washington, D.C. and right here in Jerusalem. Folks, you see the website and phone number there on your screen. Our team at Christians United for Israel wants you to join our movement of over 4 million followers of Jesus who are working nonstop to make sure that the U.S.-Israel relationship remains stronger than ever. You saw our rapid response on the Syrian border. That's the kind of influence that the God of Israel has given us. So come be a part of what God is doing in this land today. Psalm 37 says that the wicked plot against the righteous and gnash their teeth at them, but the Lord laughs at them, for he knows their day is coming. Are you listening, Iranian regime? I sincerely hope so. Well, thanks for joining us this week on The Watchman from Jerusalem and the Syrian border. Until next time, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace.